Why did she feel the silence before she ever saw the storm? Sarah had learned to trust the spaces between sounds, the slight hesitation of the wind, the vibration in the yoke, the hush that slipped into the cockpit just before chaos arrived. That night, high above the Arctic, the silence wrapped around her like a warning. It was February 3rd, 2018, a date she would remember for the rest of her life. And maybe, she thought, tightening her grip on the controls, it would be the date that ended it. She wasn't supposed to be alone up here, not really. Somewhere on the ground at Barrow Research Station, there were scientists waiting for her supplies. Crates of medical kits, fuel packs, communication gear, even a few boxes of chocolates one of the officers had smuggled in for the crew. But up here, in the cockpit of a lumbering C-130 Hercules, Sarah might as well have been the last person alive. The radio hissed, then went dead, static only. Her eyes swept across the panel. Instruments flickered, numbers shifted, readings contradicted each other. She knew the Arctic could bend reality, twist it in ways that mocked training. But this was worse than anything in the manuals. "Hold it together," she whispered, a phrase meant for the aircraft but more for herself. She had always been the calm one. 31 years old, just over 2,000 logged hours, most of them in unforgiving skis. She had flown in deserts where the sandstorm swallowed the horizon, in mountains where crosswinds snapped aircraft like matchsticks, in black nights over where tracer fire stitched the sky. But none of that mattered here. The Arctic didn't play by the same rules. It wasn't an enemy you could outmaneuver. It was vast, merciless, patient. It waited for mistakes. Her training officer used to tell her, "Up there, Sarah, the cold doesn't kill you fast. It kills you slow when your decisions get soft." She thought of that now, watching the storm radar blur into angry reds and impossible shapes. Meteorologists would later call it a once-in-a-century event. But in the cockpit, Sarah didn't need anyone's classifications. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. This storm wasn't meant to be flown through. The first impact was sudden. A downdraft slammed the Hercules so hard her teeth clacked. Alarms screamed. The horizon tilted. She fought the yoke with everything she had, muscles straining as if she were trying to hold the entire sky in place. For a moment she thought of her father. He'd been a pilot too, though he'd never worn a uniform. Bush planes in Alaska supplied drops for miners, the kind of flying where one mistake meant no one ever found the wreck. She remembered him saying once, "The sky gives you seconds, Sarah. Just seconds. Learn to spend them well." She had 30 seconds now, maybe less. Her right engine coughed, then failed. Ice was crawling over the wings faster than the de-icing systems could burn it off. The plane wasn't flying anymore. It was falling with a pretense of grace. She forced herself to breathe. She needed flat ground. Something, anything, to break against without tearing her apart. The altimeter spun down like a clock counting her final moments. She saw it then, a pale stretch between jagged ice ridges. It wasn't perfect, but it was all she had. She angled toward it, hands steady, eyes locked, as if focus alone could bend fate. The impact wasn't a landing. It was survival masquerading as violence. Metal screamed, tore, snapped. Crates exploded free of their straps. The fuselage ripped apart in sections. For one long second, Sarah thought her body was separating too, consciousness breaking into shards. Then stillness. Her world ended in silence again, a silence different from the one before the storm. This was heavy, absolute, the kind that buried sound beneath snow and wreckage. She opened her eyes. The cockpit was gone. She was wedged into her seat, which had somehow torn free and slid against a wall of ice. Her right shoulder was wrong, dislocated, maybe broken. Blood dripped down her temple, freezing before it reached her jawline. She tried to move. Pain lanced through her ribs. Breathing was sharp, shallow, but she was alive, somehow impossibly alive. And then came the thought that chilled her more than the wind. No one knows I'm here. Her emergency beacon was smashed. The radio lay in twisted pieces. Outside, the storm roared on, a white curtain over the endless Arctic. Even if someone had been looking for her and she doubted they were, no signal could cut through that. For a long time she just sat there, listening to her heartbeat pound in her ears, louder than the wind. She thought of Anchorage, of the hangar lights, of her crew laughing before takeoff. She thought of the researchers at Barrow, waiting for supplies that would never come. She thought of the military back home, where someone might be updating a board, changing her flight status from en route to overdue. Would they search? Maybe. But out here, search meant nothing. The Arctic swallowed plains whole, erased their trails, left nothing but ice and silence. Sarah had been on recovery missions before. She had seen the wreckage, the frostbitten bodies, the empty cockpits. She knew what the odds were. The realization hit hard, almost harder than the crash itself. If I don't figure this out, I won't last a week. Her training snapped back into focus. Injuries first, shelter second, supplies third. She gritted her teeth, braced against the ice, and shoved her shoulder back into its socket with a scream that vanished into the howling wind. Pain, tears, but the joint held. Next, shelter. The fuselage wreck offered jagged walls, scraps of insulation, half-buried crates. It wasn't much, but it was something between her and the cold. She clawed her way toward it, dragging her body like it belonged to someone else. Each movement tore at her ribs, but stopping wasn't an option. The wind would freeze her within minutes. By the time she collapsed inside the broken shell of the aircraft, her body was shaking uncontrollably. She pressed her forehead against cold metal, whispered to herself, "Alive. You're alive." The first night was endless. Darkness pressed down, the wind screamed, the wreck groaned like a living thing. Every few minutes Sarah jolted awake, certain the ice was shifting to bury her alive. Her mind conjured voices, her father, her crew, even strangers she'd met years ago, all of them speaking, laughing, mocking, fatting. She wasn't sure if it was concussion or fear. Maybe both. By dawn, she wasn't sure she wanted to see the light. The world outside was white, endless, merciless. The kind of beauty that didn't care if you lived or died. What little she had. A med kit salvaged from the cargo, a few energy bars, half a canteen of water. She could melt snow, but fuel for heat. That was the real problem. She found insulation, a few seat cushions, wooden crates splintered from the impact. Enough for a fire, maybe two, not more. As the hours bled into days, reality pressed harder. Food for maybe 3 weeks if she rationed. The Arctic didn't give second chances. She'd have to decide, stretch the supplies or break into the unimaginable. Because deep down, even then, Sarah knew, this wasn't going to be weeks, it was going to be months. And something inside her whispered, maybe it was madness, maybe it was instinct, you will eat things you never thought possible. You will do what no one else would dare. You will survive. But she didn't say it out loud, not yet. Instead, she lay back against the cold metal, closed her eyes, and let the silence wash over her again. A silence that carried a question she couldn't escape. How long before the world forgets you're even out here? What do you do when every instinct screams to wait, but you know waiting will kill you? Sarah sat inside the shattered fuselage, the Arctic wind gnawing at the walls of her improvised shelter. Her breath plumed in the frozen air, each exhale a reminder of how fragile warmth had become. Hours had turned into a day. A day had blurred into two, and still no sound of engines in the distance, no hope cutting through the endless white sky. She pressed her back against the torn aluminum, ribs aching with each inhale. The medical kit lay open beside her, gauze stained red from the gash along her temple, painkillers rationed down to a single pill she hadn't dared to swallow yet. Every decision felt heavier now, measured not in convenience but in survival. Her shoulder throbbed where she had slammed it back into place. She'd done it by instinct, with the kind of brutal determination they drilled into soldiers. Don't wait for help. Fix yourself or you don't get fixed at all. The pain hadn't faded. If anything, it had become sharper, more constant, a reminder of her own body's limits. She thought of the hangar again, of the pre-flight briefing, when her crew had laughed about how routine the run would be. She could still see their faces, and it haunted her, the thought that maybe they believed she was gone already, a name added to a list, a notification sent to her family with nothing but "lost in weather" stamped across the report. But she wasn't gone, not yet. Day 3 forced her into action. The rations, carefully counted, carefully halved, stared back at her like a clock ticking down to zero. The Arctic didn't offer second chances, and she knew better than to let comfort trick her. So she began the ritual: melt snow in a dented canteen, boil it over a fire made of torn seat cushions and crate splinters, sip the water as though it were medicine. Every flame she lit felt like a negotiation with time. By day 4, hunger had grown into something darker. The energy bars she had split into tiny portions no longer fooled her body. Her stomach cramped, her thoughts wandered, her focus frayed. That was the danger she feared most. Not the cold, not the storm, but the slow unraveling of her mind. She forced herself to move, exercises in the cramped wreckage, stretches, even push-ups when her ribs allowed. Anything to keep blood flowing, to keep despair from turning into paralysis. Because she knew how it happened. She had read the reports, studied the cases. People didn't always freeze to death in the Arctic. Sometimes they just stopped trying. But the nights tested her resolve in ways daylight couldn't. The wind screamed like voices in the distance. Once she swore she heard her name whispered through the cracks in the fuselage. Another time she thought she saw a shadow moving just beyond the wreck, taller than a man, slipping between ice ridges. She grabbed a piece of twisted metal, her makeshift weapon, and held it all night, knuckles white, eyes burning as she fought against sleep. By morning nothing, just white, just silence. Day 5 brought something worse than hunger, choice. She had known it was coming. Every survival course, every lecture, every hard-eyed instructor had told her, there will be a day when what you consider food will no longer matter. She had always nodded, always believed it. But belief was easy in a classroom. Now she stared at the leather straps of a torn seat harness, her body shaking with hunger, and she realized belief was useless. She boiled the leather, watched it curl and soften in the water. The smell was foul, chemical, nothing like food. She gagged even before lifting it to her lips. But she chewed anyway, swallowing slow, forcing herself to keep it down. Her stomach recoiled, but it accepted. And for the first time since the crash, she felt the faintest flicker of strength. It wasn't nourishment. It wasn't a meal. It was survival dressed as desperation. She cried afterward. Not loud, not long, but the tears came hot, and for a moment she hated herself for crossing a line. But then another thought rose in her chest, steadier, colder. I did what I had to do, and I will do it again. Day 6 tested her with memory. She dreamt of kitchens, of warm bread, of the smell of coffee drifting from her mother's house on Sunday mornings. She woke with the taste of ashes in her mouth, her fists clenched so hard her nails cut her palms. The Arctic had no mercy for nostalgia, and yet she couldn't stop it. The memories came uninvited, than the wind. She began talking to herself more often. Short phrases, reminders: melt the snow, check the fire, move, Sarah, move. It kept her sane, or something close to it. Silence was dangerous. It let the mind spiral into places darker than hunger. By day 7, she realized she had stopped counting in hours. The crash, the cold, the hunger, it had all stretched time into something unrecognizable. She measured her life in small victories instead. A fire lit, water boiled, pain endured without screaming. That night she sat by the flickering glow of burning insulation, the smoke thick and bitter. Her hands shook as she held the last of her rations, half a bar, wrapped carefully like treasure. She stared at it for a long time, thinking of how easily she could end the hunger just for a night. But she didn't eat it. Not yet. She put it back, sealed it away. Because she understood something now. This wasn't going to be a matter of days. The Arctic had no interest in letting her go, and if rescue came, it wouldn't be soon. She leaned her head back against the cold metal, closed her eyes, and let the silence sink in again. There was something she hadn't told anyone, not even herself, not yet. something she knew deep down but couldn't say aloud. That if she wanted to survive this, she would have to become someone she didn't recognize. What happens when the silence starts speaking back? By the second week, Sarah realized hunger wasn't just in her stomach anymore. It had moved into her head, a constant buzzing that blurred thoughts, shortened memory, twisted perception. Sometimes, in the middle of melting snow or stacking insulation against the fuselage wall, she would stop and forget what she was doing. Her hands would move without her. Her body drifted through tasks like a machine that had lost the memory of its maker. And yet she kept going, because stopping meant death. The rations were gone by then. Even the last half-bar she'd hoarded, tucked away like a secret promise, had vanished into her bloodstream days ago. What remained was leather. Torn straps, scraps of harness, seat covers ripped and boiled until the water turned black. She chewed carefully, swallowing small pieces, letting them dissolve into something her body could trick itself into believing was fuel. But the mind knew better. On day 13, she heard voices. At first faint like radio static cutting through the storm. She froze, straining to listen. Maybe a rescue team, maybe another aircraft. But when she stepped outside, wind clawing at her face, there was nothing. Just the white horizon stretching forever. When she returned to the wreck, the voices followed, not from outside, from inside. She heard her father again, his steady voice giving her advice about the skis, about spending seconds wisely. She heard her training officer, barking orders, telling her not to get soft. Once, she swore she heard her own name whispered in a woman's voice she didn't recognize. She sat up all night, waiting for the voice to return, but it didn't. By the third week, the hallucinations weren't just voices. She began to see shapes moving across the ice. Shadows taller than men, gliding silently, never close enough to touch but always at the edge of her vision. Once she saw her mother standing in the snow, apron dusted with flour, hands outstretched as though offering food. Sarah stumbled toward the figure before collapsing, her breath tearing in her chest. When she looked up, nothing remained but a drift of snow. That was the night she broke for the first time. She pressed her forehead against the cold aluminum floor and sobbed until her throat burned. No one heard her. No one came. And when the tears dried, the silence swallowed her again. But inside the despair, something hardened. If I'm going to die here, she thought, it won't be because I gave up. It will be because the Arctic finally outlasted me. She forced herself to innovate. The leather wasn't enough. Her body was losing weight fast, her muscles shrinking, her hands trembling even when she tried to stay still. She turned to the wreckage again, scanning it not for comfort but for calories. Plastic, fabric, things no one would ever consider edible. She remembered fragments of survival training instructors talking about emergency nutrition, about pushing the boundaries of what the body could tolerate. She boiled strips of fabric until they softened into a tasteless pulp. She shaved tiny slivers of certain plastics, careful not to take too much, afraid of poisoning herself. It wasn't food, it was survival in its ugliest form. The process itself became ritual. Boil, chew, swallow, endure. She hated every moment, gagged at the taste, fought against the instinct to spit it out. But she didn't stop, because stopping wasn't an option. Each discovery, each moment her body accepted the impossible, felt like a small victory. But it came at a cost. Her dreams grew darker. One night she dreamt she was back in the cockpit, engines failing, alarms blaring. But when she looked to her right, the seat beside her wasn't empty. It was occupied by a version of herself, pale, starved, hollow-eyed. The other Sarah smiled, leaned close, and whispered, "You're not going to make it." She woke drenched in sweat, teeth chattering, the echo of her own voice still in her ears. The next day she made herself a promise. She spoke it aloud, letting her words cut through the silence. "You don't get to quit, not now, not here." But doubt lingered. She thought often of the people who might still be waiting. The researchers at Barrow may be wondering why supplies hadn't come. The base in Anchorage may be marking her as lost. Her family. Did they light a candle for her yet? Did they cry, or did they hold onto hope longer than they should? The hardest part wasn't the hunger. It wasn't even the cold. It was the possibility that no one, anywhere, was looking anymore, that her fight meant nothing. And still she fought. On day 19, she tried something new, fermenting scraps of organic material to break them down into digestible compounds. She had no real equipment, just dented metal containers and shards of broken glass repurposed as tools. The process was slow, dangerous, full of risk, but it worked. The taste was foul, but she kept it down. Her body, though weakened, clung to whatever it could. She marked the day by scratching a line into the fuselage wall with a piece of jagged aluminum. She stared at the row of scratches, counted them twice. 19. The number looked small, insignificant against the vast white outside. But it was hers, proof that she was still here. That night, as the storm howled, she whispered a thought she had never dared before. Maybe this isn't just about surviving. Maybe it's about proving it can be done. The Arctic didn't answer, it didn't care, but inside her something shifted. She wasn't just a soldier waiting for rescue anymore. She was a woman carving out life in a place meant only for death. What keeps a person alive after the hunger becomes normal? By the fourth week, Sarah had stopped expecting her stomach to feel full. Hunger wasn't a sharp pain anymore. It was a constant background hum like the wind outside, always there, always gnawing, but almost familiar now. Her body had accepted starvation. What it hadn't accepted was weakness. She woke each morning, if morning could be trusted in a world where light bled across the horizon for only a handful of hours, with a ritual. Melt snow, boil scraps, chew the unthinkable, stretch her body even when her muscles trembled, speak her thoughts out loud so silence didn't consume her. Survival wasn't just about food anymore. It was about rhythm, discipline, control. But control was fragile. She had started keeping marks on the fuselage wall, one line for each day. By the end of the first month, the wall looked like a tally kept by a prisoner, each scratch both proof of endurance and reminder of captivity. She ran her fingers across the marks sometimes, just to feel that she had been more than a hallucination in the snow. Her body was shrinking. She saw it in the reflection of a shard of cockpit glass. Sunken cheeks, hollow eyes, ribs sharp against pale skin. Her lips cracked and bled from the cold. Her hair had frozen into brittle strands she tore off without thinking. But the worst was her hands. Once strong, precise, the hands of a pilot, they now shook even when she tried to hold them still. And yet those hands kept working. They built tools from twisted metal. They shaped containers from scraps. They tore insulation to line the walls. Every task was a negotiation with weakness, but Sarah forced herself through it, because giving in meant letting the Arctic win. On day 32, she discovered something she hadn't dared hope for: wood. Splintered crates buried deeper in the snow, remnants of the cargo she had been carrying. The moment she saw it, her breath caught. Wood meant fire. Fire meant life. She carried the pieces back, arms straining, ribs screaming with each step. She built a fire that night larger than she'd allowed herself in weeks. Flames licked the dark, and for a moment she felt something like victory. She sat close enough to feel her skin sting with heat, eyes closing, body trembling, not from cold this time, but from the fragile comfort of warmth. But comfort was dangerous. Comfort tempted the mind to believe rescue was close, to ease discipline. She couldn't afford that illusion. By week 5, Sarah had developed a system for food. She ranked materials by how digestible they were, rationed them in order, forced herself to rotate so her body wouldn't collapse under one toxic substance. Leather first, then fabrics stripped of dye, then slivers of organic padding, then boiled wood fibers. None of it was enough, but together it became a grotesque diet that kept her alive. She told herself it wasn't disgusting. It was fuel, that's all. And yet sometimes, when chewing on boiled straps, she would close her eyes and taste real food: bread, meat, coffee. Her mind betrayed her, painting illusions so vivid she wanted to scream. She learned to push them away quickly, because if she lingered, tears came, and tears wasted energy she didn't have. Her strength dipped low in those weeks. Standing too fast made the world spin. Lifting cargo scraps left her gasping, but she fought through it. She created exercises, small, deliberate movements to keep her body from completely surrendering, push-ups with trembling arms, squats that made her vision blur. She counted each one out loud, the numbers anchoring her in a place where time was dissolving. But it wasn't just her body she had to manage, it was her mind. The hallucinations grew bolder. Shadows moving at the edge of her vision became figures now. Sometimes soldiers in Arctic gear, approaching as if to rescue her, only to vanish when she blinked. Sometimes animals, wolves, bears, stalking her in silence. And once, late at night, she swore she saw herself again, standing in the doorway of the fuselage, watching with a mixture of pity and warning. She spoke back this time. "I'm still here," she whispered. "You don't get to take me yet." The vision didn't answer. It never did, but the act of speaking steadied her. Then came the thaw. It was subtle at first. The air, though still freezing, didn't claw her lungs as sharply. The snow around the wreck softened, shifted, and one morning faint green pushed through the melting crust. Vegetation. Life. Sarah stared at it, stunned. After weeks of nothing but white, color felt impossible. She crawled toward it, weak hands brushing frost away to reveal tiny shoots of Arctic grass. She hesitated, then chewed them, desperate for anything that resembled real food. The taste was bitter, almost unbearable, but her body welcomed it. Vitamins, minerals, a reminder of the world beyond wreckage and leather. Hope surged, but so did fear, because where vegetation returned, so did wildlife. The first sign was tracks, paw prints pressed into slush not far from her shelter. Large, heavy, bear maybe, predator. That night Sarah didn't sleep. She sat with her makeshift weapon, a jagged strip of aluminum sharpened on stone, clutched in her shaking hands. Every crack of ice outside became a threat. Every gust of wind carried danger. She realized then that survival wasn't a straight line. It wasn't about making it through the crash or the first week or even a month. Every new day brought something different, a new threat, a new choice, a new reason to break. But she hadn't broken yet. By week 6, Sarah had built something resembling routine. She ate grass when she could find it, combined it with her gruesome materials diet, drank melted snow when it stayed clean. She exercised, spoke aloud, fought hallucinations. She lit small fires, rationed wood carefully. She was surviving. But deep inside, she felt the weight of truth pressing harder. Rescue wasn't coming soon, maybe not at all. And as she stared out at the thawing horizon, the ice shifting and cracking under distant ridges, she whispered words she hadn't said before. "I might be the only one who ever knows I made it this far. What do you hold on to when your body has nothing left to give?" By the 7th week, Sarah's reflection was almost unrecognizable. Her face had become a hollow mask, eyes sunken, lips split, cheeks drawn tight over bone. When she flexed her arms, the skin hung loose, muscle wasted. She traced the outline of her ribs and wondered how much more could vanish before something vital disappeared forever. Her body was failing, but her mind, that was the battlefield now. Each day felt like a slow negotiation with collapse. She would wake shivering, pulse faint, vision swimming, and force herself to repeat the ritual. Melt snow, chew scraps, move. Every task was a command, not a choice. Stand up. Light the fire. Do not stop. She gave herself orders the way she once did as a pilot when checklists meant life or death. But now the checklist was survival itself. Food was nearly gone in the traditional sense. The seat covers and straps had been stripped, boiled, consumed. Fabric had been chewed to threads. Even wood fibers, her last fallback, were harder to find. Her body cried out for something it could not name, not calories, not flavor, but minerals, strength, life. And that was when she turned to the unthinkable, metal. The idea had haunted her since the 2nd week. During training, Instructors had hinted at the possibility that, in desperate circumstances, trace amounts of processed metal could be used to supply missing minerals. But no one had explained how. No one expected anyone to actually try. It was knowledge tucked away in footnotes, not manuals. Sarah had no choice. She broke shards of the fuselage into filings, heated them, tried to leach small particles into water. The process was crude, dangerous. One wrong choice and poison would end her faster than starvation. She tested tiny sips first, waited hours, monitored her own body like a doctor without tools. Dizziness came, then nausea, but she endured. When she woke the next morning still breathing, still moving, she knew she had found another way to stretch her life. It wasn't much, it didn't give her strength, but it kept her alive, and alive was enough. Yet her mind refused to stay steady. The hallucinations grew darker with every passing day. She saw soldiers standing in the distance, rifles in hand, waiting for her command. She heard her father's voice, but this time it wasn't comforting. It mocked her, called her weak, told her she was any more. Once she dreamt she was in a debriefing room, clean uniform, hair tied back, officers leaning forward to hear her speak. She opened her mouth to describe the crash, the survival, the hunger, but nothing came out. She looked down and her tongue was gone. She woke screaming into the empty wreck, her throat raw, tears freezing on her cheeks. By the 8th week she began to lose track of reality itself. The tally marks on the wall blurred. She counted them again and again, numbers slipping through her mind like sand through fingers. 19, 30, 42. Was it accurate? She didn't know anymore. Her sanity wavered. She began writing with charcoal scraps from burnt wood, scribbling words onto metal sheets. At first they were notes: fire, water, ration. But then they became fragments: don't stop, still here. Alive. Sometimes entire sentences poured out of her, half coherent, a conversation with herself. She filled space after space with her handwriting, as if covering the wreck with words could keep her tethered to the world. But the breaking point came one night on week 9. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, not properly. Every breath burned. Her vision was fractured, doubled, blurred. She lay on the cold metal, unable to rise, staring at the shadowy ceiling. And for the first time since the crash, the thought came with terrifying clarity: I could stop now. I could close my eyes and let it end. She pictured it, the cold seeping in, her body relaxing, the fight over. It didn't feel like surrender. It felt like peace. And then something interrupted. It wasn't a sound, not a voice, not a shadow. It was a memory. Her father again, not mocking this time, not instructing, just looking at her, that quiet gaze he carried when he flew, steady, calm, knowing the sky could kill but never letting it see fear. She remembered the last words he said before she joined the Air Force. The storm doesn't end when you want it to, Sarah. It ends when you outlast it. She clung to that. With the last of her strength, she whispered the words aloud: outlast it. The phrase became her anchor. She repeated it over and over, a mantra that beat back the darkness each time it crept too close. By week 10, something remarkable happened. She realized she wasn't just surviving, she was adapting. Her body was frail, yes. Her mind fractured. But she was still here, still pushing, still outlasting. She learned to combine her scraps, blending small amounts of different materials into broths that tricked her system into extracting more from less. She created a rotation for her meals, disciplined and methodical, almost scientific. And though her body trembled with every movement, though her reflection showed nothing but a shadow of the soldier she once was, Sarah felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared in weeks. Hope. Not hope for rescue, she had stopped expecting that, but hope in herself. She could do this for another day, another week, as long as it took. And as the Arctic wind howled against the wreckage, Sarah pressed her palm to the tally marks, whispered to herself, and believed it. I can outlast this. What do you fear more, the silence that starves you, or the sound that means something is hunting? By the 11th week, Sarah's survival no longer felt improvised. It felt ritualized, rehearsed, almost mechanical. She had created a system not out of choice but necessity. Eat scraps in rotation. Melt snow at dawn and dusk. Burn wood sparingly. Move the body even when the body screamed against it. Write words, scratch marks, keep count, keep mind. It wasn't living, but it was surviving. Her body had grown skeletal, hands trembling constantly, but she had learned to function inside the weakness. She could carry wood, sharpen tools, scrape ice from the fuselage. Each act, no matter how small, was a rebellion against the Arctic's indifference. And then one morning, the world changed again. Light more of it. For weeks, the sun had been a rumor, a ghost slipping across the horizon before disappearing into endless dark. But now it lingered, stretching shadows long across the snow. The thaw was coming. Spring, fragile and fleeting in the Arctic, had begun. At first it lifted her. She stepped outside the wreck and felt something she hadn't in months, warmth, faint but undeniable, pressing against her face. Snow softened under her boots, and then impossible, miraculous color appeared. Green shoots pushing up through cracks in the ice. Moss, grass, tiny veins of life against a white world. Sarah knelt in the slush and wept, not from weakness but from wonder. She chewed the grass slowly, savoring the bitterness as if it were a feast. It wasn't much, not enough calories to save her, but it was something the wreck hadn't given her, something alive. But where there was life, there was danger. She noticed the tracks again, larger this time, claws gouging through softened snow, bare, no question. At first she told herself it was distant, that the animal had passed and gone. But on the 12th week, the lie broke. She woke to a sound unlike any the Arctic winds could make, a low, guttural growl. She froze, heartbeat hammering. Slowly, she crawled to the edge of the fuselage, peered through a gap. There it was, massive, white, shoulders rolling as it moved across the snow, a polar bear, the top predator of this frozen world. And she, starved, skeletal, armed with nothing but a shard of metal, was nothing more than prey. The bear sniffed the air, drawn by the smell of smoke, maybe scraps of leather broth. It lumbered closer, each step shaking the ground until it was only yards away. Sarah gripped her weapon, hands shaking violently. She knew she had no chance in a fight. The only hope was fear, make herself large, loud, unpredictable. So she did what instinct told her. She screamed. Her voice tore through the wreckage, high, sharp, ragged. She banged metal against metal, sparks flying. She roared like a creature she wasn't, forcing every ounce of air from her lungs. The bear paused, head tilted. For one breathless second, Sarah thought it would charge. Then slowly it turned, lumbered away back across the thawing snow. Sarah collapsed into the fuselage, chest heaving, vision swimming. She laughed once, a broken sound, half relief, half madness. She had survived the storm, the crash, starvation, and now a predator. But the encounter left her shaken, because for the first time she had faced something she couldn't outlast through discipline. If the bear had chosen differently, it would have ended her. The thought lingered through the following days. She sharpened her weapon more carefully, built walls of crates at the fuselage entrance, slept with one eye open, body coiled for threats. Survival wasn't just about food anymore. It was about defense. By the 13th week, her health plummeted again. The burst of strength from grass and moss faded quickly. Malnutrition tightened its grip. Her skin cracked, gums bled, muscles spasmed without warning. Standing left her dizzy. Twice, she fainted while melting snow, waking on the frozen floor with burns across her hands from the fire she'd nearly fallen into. She kept moving anyway, even if crawling, even if gasping, because to stop was to die. The hallucinations reached their peak in this period. Voices came daily now. Sometimes they were kind, her mother's laughter, her father's advice. Sometimes cruel, officers mocking her, strangers telling her to quit. The figures returned too, soldiers, family, shadows that moved with purpose but never touched her. And one night she saw the bear again. Inside the fuselage this time, standing over her. She jolted awake, screaming, only to find nothing there. Just shadows, just cold. Her breakdown came on day 97. She had been boiling scraps of fabric when the pot tipped, spilling precious broth across the floor. She dropped to her knees, clawing at the liquid, trying to scoop it back into the can, hands burning, tears falling. For the first time since the crash, she screamed words instead of sounds. I can't do this anymore." Her voice echoed off the wreckage, mocking her. She slumped forward, face pressed to cold metal, sobbing like a child. And then silence again. Minutes passed, maybe hours, and slowly something steadied inside her. She wiped her face, forced her hands to stop shaking, whispered through clenched teeth, "Yes, you can." It wasn't comfort, it wasn't hope, it was defiance. By the 14th week, Sarah had crossed into something beyond survival. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was inventing. She discovered that combining boiled grasses with softened wood fibers created a pulp that her body tolerated better than either alone. She fermented moss to break it down, despite the risk of rot. Every experiment, scribbling notes with charcoal on the fuselage walls. She wasn't just fighting to stay alive. She was teaching herself how to live in a place no one had ever lived before. But at night, when the Arctic quieted, when the fire burned low and the tally marks on the wall stared back at her, Sarah knew the truth. She was alive, but only barely. And if rescue didn't come soon, even outlasting might not be enough. What does it mean to live when survival itself becomes the only identity you have left? By the 15th week, Sarah no longer thought of time in the same way she once had. Hours had stopped meaning anything. Even days blurred into a rhythmless haze of cold, hunger, and exhaustion. What mattered now were the marks on the fuselage wall, one scratch for each day she had endured. That wall had become her calendar, her witness, her proof. 92 marks, then 93, then 94, each new line carved with trembling hands, each one a statement, still here. Her body was breaking down in ways she could no longer ignore. She moved slowly, every step deliberate, conserving precious calories. Her gums bled when she chewed, her nails cracked and peeled away. At times, her vision blurred so badly she thought she was going blind. But she forced herself to adapt, not through strength, but through invention. It wasn't enough anymore to chew boiled leather or scraps of wood. Her body had reached its limit with those. She needed more, not just fuel, but balance. So she became a scientist inside her wreckage laboratory. She experimented with combinations. Grass fermented with moss, leather softened and mixed with wood pulp. Even the smallest flakes of metal, dissolved in water, taken in carefully measured sips. She charted the effects on scraps of metal, carving notes with a sharp edge: good, bad, nausea, strength. The wreck became covered in her handwriting, the records of a woman both surviving and studying her own survival. It gave her something she hadn't had in weeks: purpose. Because purpose was power. On day 98, she discovered something by accident. She had left moss soaking in melted snow too long, forgotten in her haze of exhaustion. When she returned, the water had taken on a sour, fermented taste. Against instinct, she tried it. Hours later, she realized it had broken down in her stomach more easily than usual. The nausea was less. The strength was slightly more. She laughed, a sharp, startled sound that echoed against the metal walls. She had created something new, crude, dangerous, but effective. Another piece of the puzzle. Another way to fight. Still, the fight wasn't just against hunger. It was against silence. By now, the hallucinations had become part of her life. She didn't try to fight them anymore. Sometimes they gave her comfort. Sometimes they gave her warning. She knew they weren't real, but they felt real enough to ease the ache of solitude. One night she saw her father again, sitting across from her by the dim glow of the fire. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, nodding once as if to say, "Keep going." She wept silently in the dark, knowing he wasn't there, but needing him anyway. Other nights the voices turned cruel, telling her she was already dead, telling her the tally marks meant nothing, telling her no one was coming. She shouted back then, voice breaking, words lost to the wind. But each morning, she carved a new mark into the wall. On day 100 she paused. The mark was different, heavier. She pressed the shard of metal into the fuselage and carved slowly, deliberately, until the line was deep and jagged. She stared at it for a long time. 100 days. 100 days of hunger, cold, hallucinations, and fear. 100 days of silence. 100 days of becoming someone she had never imagined she could be. Most people didn't last a week in the Arctic. 10 days at most, survival experts said, but she had reached 100, and still she wasn't done. She whispered to herself, voice low but steady, "You've outlasted them all." It wasn't pride, it wasn't even hope. It was survival distilled into its truth. She was still alive. But that milestone came with a shadow, because with it came the terrifying thought, what if I keep surviving and no one ever comes? The idea burrowed deep. It followed her through every task, every ritual. What if the world has already moved on? What if the tally marks end not with rescue, but with silence eternal? The weight of it pressed hardest at night. She would lie awake, listening to the crackle of her tiny fire, staring at the marks on the wall, and wonder if she was leaving behind anything more than scratches on metal. That was when she began documenting more deliberately. She wrote not just notes about her experiments but full accounts. How she boiled leather, how she fermented moss, how she rationed wood. She wrote them as though someone might read them one day, as though her suffering could mean something beyond herself. "If I die here," she whispered one night, "let it not be wasted." By the 17th week the thaw deepened. More vegetation appeared, grasses, mosses, even tiny flowers bursting through slush. It wasn't abundance, but it was color, and Sarah clung to it. She foraged daily, weak hands tearing at the earth, gathering whatever she could find. But with the thaw came animals, birds wheeling overhead, fox tracks across the snow, and again the paw prints of the predator she feared most. The polar bear hadn't returned in weeks, but the signs were fresh now. She knew it was still out there, circling, waiting for weakness. The thought haunted her. She sharpened her weapon again, built her walls higher, even prepared escape routes through gaps in the wreckage. But deep down, she knew if it came again, her survival wouldn't depend on preparation. It would depend on chance. Still, she chose defiance. Every step outside, every scrap gathered, every tally mark carved, was her way of telling the Arctic and herself that she wasn't done yet. By the 18th week, her body was little more than skin and bone. She staggered more than walked, collapsed often, gasped for breath after even small exertions. And yet she kept moving, because she had made a promise, to her father, to herself, to the tally marks on the wall. Outlasted. 126, 127. Each mark carved deeper, darker, as though she could etch her existence permanently into the metal. Proof that she had been here. Proof that she had endured. And though she didn't know it yet, those marks were counting down. Because soon, the silence she had lived with for months would finally break. What if the world finds you only after you've stopped believing it will? On the 127th day, Sarah had long since stopped expecting salvation. Rescue wasn't part of her imagination anymore. It was a story she had let go of somewhere between the leather broth and the hallucinated voices. Her survival was hers alone now, not waiting for helicopters, not dreaming of reunions. Just her, the wreckage, and the tally marks that lined the wall like a record no one would ever read. That morning she woke weaker than she had ever felt. Her body trembled uncontrollably, her breath shallow. She struggled to lift herself from the frozen metal floor. Even scratching the day's mark into the wall felt monumental. She carved it anyway, 127, pressing the shard until her hand bled. Proof, still here. She sat there for a long time, staring at it, whispering the mantra that had carried her through the worst. Outlasted. And then she heard it. Not the wind, not the groaning of ice. A different sound, distant but real, a hum, a vibration in the sky. For a moment she thought it was another hallucination, her mind playing tricks, offering false hope, but the hum grew louder, stronger. She staggered to her feet, heart pounding, legs buckling. She crawled to the opening of the fuselage, peered into the horizon. There, cutting across the pale blue sky, an aircraft. Her breath caught, her vision blurred with tears. She stumbled outside into snow and slush, arms raised. She screamed, voice cracking, barely audible over the roar of engines. She waved debris, reflective metal shards, anything that might catch the light. At first the plane kept going. Her heart sank, her voice broke. She screamed again, every ounce of strength tearing from her chest. Then, impossibly, it circled. The aircraft banked, turned, slowed. A survey plane, its pilot likely scanning the horizon for geological markers, had seen something it couldn't ignore. The strange, scattered debris field of a wreck that shouldn't exist. And movement, a human shape waving desperately below. Sarah collapsed to her knees as the plane dipped lower, banking again. Flare dropped, a signal they had seen her. The hours that followed blurred into fragments. The sound of rotor blades as a helicopter arrived, figures in heavy gear rushing toward her, hands lifting her, voices muffled, urgent. She wanted to speak, to explain, but the words tangled in her throat. All she managed was a whisper, 127. The rescuers didn't understand then. They would later. She faded in and out as they carried her aboard, wrapped her in blankets, fed her sips of water. She saw faces above her, wide-eyed, stunned, disbelieving. They couldn't understand how she was still alive. Neither could she. Her recovery took months. Hospitals, IV drips, careful refeeding as her body relearned what nourishment meant. Doctors shook their heads, whispered to each other about impossible endurance, about how her organs had somehow resisted complete failure. They told her she had redefined the limits of human survival. She didn't feel like a miracle. She felt like a shadow learning to step back into light. The debriefing was long, clinical. Officers questioned every detail. How had she treated injuries? What had she eaten? How had she kept her mind from breaking completely? Sarah explained, step by step, the methods she had created: boiling leather, fermenting moss, leaching minerals from metal. At first, they doubted her. Then, reluctantly, they believed. Her notes, scrawled across metal and fuselage walls, became evidence. They were photographed, studied, filed into survival manuals. What she had done was not madness. It was innovation. Desperation turned into method. But behind the questions, behind the medical examinations, lay something no one asked about: the silence. The endless days of being alone, unheard, unseen. The nights spent staring at shadows, whispering to herself to keep from unraveling. The hallucinations that had been both torment and company. That part of the story lived only in her. Years later, Sarah returned to flying. Not because she wanted to prove anything, but because the sky was still part of her. She sat in a cockpit again, hands steady on the controls, and for the first time since the crash, she felt peace. Not because the danger was gone, but because she had already faced the worst danger imaginable: being forgotten. Her story became legend among survival instructors, a classified case study whispered to soldiers and pilots preparing for the extremes. They spoke of the method, the techniques she had invented in the wreck. They marveled at her endurance, her will. But Sarah never thought of herself as extraordinary. She thought only of the tally marks, of the wall that bore her proof. 127 days. She knew those marks would never fade from her memory, even if the wreck itself rusted into the ice. Sometimes she would close her eyes and hear the Arctic wind again, feel the gnaw of hunger, the burn of cracked skin. And in those moments, she remembered what the ordeal had taught her. That survival isn't always about strength, or training, or even hope. Sometimes it's about dignity, quiet, steady, unyielding. The kind that refuses to quit, even when no one is watching. The kind that carves a line into cold metal every day, whispering still here. And in the end, that's what Sarah carried with her. Not the fear, not the pain, not even the rescue. But the truth she had lived in silence for 127 days. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.